Hey guys, tonight we're heading far, far away, across time and ocean swells, to the lush islands of ancient Hawaii. The moon is full, the surf's a soft hush in the distance, and your feet sink into warm volcanic sand. You've just stepped into a world with no clocks, no shoes clacking on pavement, no buzzing phones, just quiet protocol, sacred rules, and the steady rhythm of wind brushing through breadfruit trees. But don't get too relaxed just yet. You've landed in the domain of the Ali'i, the ruling class of old Hawaii, and one misstep, literally, could get you into serious trouble, like offend the gods and maybe vanish from history levels of trouble. You probably won't survive this if you accidentally walk in the wrong place with the wrong kind of feet. Seriously. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're barefoot naturally. Everyone is, except maybe the chief. You've been told it's best not to look too closely at their feet, or their sandals, should they be wearing them. The ground you're standing on might seem like ordinary sand, but here in ancient Hawaii, it's anything but. It's sacred, especially the soil near heiau, temples, and the pathways frequented by the Ali'i Nui, the high chiefs. You've just wandered near one of these paths, and the locals are watching you with wide, polite eyes and absolutely no movement. That's your first clue. You've crossed into a space where stillness is a kind of reverence. The second clue is the kapu stick planted at the path's edge. Kapu meaning forbidden, sacred, not to be messed with. It's not just about where you stand, it's about who walked here before you. If a chief once strode this way, even decades ago, the very dust might still be off limits to your commoner souls. In fact, your shadow, yes, even that sleepy blob following you around, could cause offense if it so much as crosses the same path as a chief. The belief wasn't metaphorical. The mana, or divine power, of a high-ranking chief was considered so intense that ordinary people had to duck, step aside, or even lie face down to avoid spiritually contaminating the chief's path. Historians still argue whether these rules were enforced equally across all islands, or if some districts were a little more relaxed. Some accounts suggest that certain coastal villages tolerated tourists, well, the ancient kind, more easily. Others say that even the whisper of your shadow on the wrong footprint could bring swift spiritual consequences, if not human ones. But tonight, no one's chasing you. Not yet. You step back gently from the kapu stick, trying not to stir too much sand, and someone finally exhales. That's your other clue. Disaster narrowly avoided. You're offered a warm bowl of something, vaguely coconut-scented, and the conversation shifts. Quietly, one of the elders points out a stretch of the beach where no one walks, not even the fishermen. That's where a chief once landed his canoe, they say, and for over a century, the spot's been kept untouched. Just sand and memory. You can't help but wonder, how do people remember the exact spot after generations? A shrug? We remember, the elder says simply. And in this place, memory isn't just storytelling, it's a form of protection. Forgetting would be the real danger. You sip your coconut something and glance down again at your feet. No shoes, no slippers, not even a sandal strap in sight. And yet, you feel the weight of rules around your ankles like braided cords. In this place, going barefoot isn't casual, it's ceremonial, it's expected. But for the highest ranks, shoes, when they were worn, weren't for comfort or practicality. They were for signaling divinity, for marking difference, for saying, these feet walk where others must not. Somewhere, a child is scolded gently for stomping near a canoe launch site. Not because it's rude, but because stomping wakes things. Gods, ancestors, old chiefs. You shuffle a little more softly. Later, someone leads you past a heiau, and you ask, perhaps unwisely, if anyone ever sweeps the pathway there. The guide pauses. The wind sweeps it, he says. We don't. A light joke bubbles up in your brain about being lucky this place doesn't have parking tickets, but you let it pass. The humor can wait. There's a kind of reverence here that isn't loud or dramatic. It's gentle, like the tide coming in. You don't trample it. You adjust your pace. You can still hear the faintest echo of those ancient rules in the way. People move, even now. How they pause before entering certain groves. How they murmur a greeting before harvesting kolo from the low eye. Everything is done with quiet permission. And just when you're starting to get comfortable again, someone mentions a name. The name of a chief who once wore sandals so sacred. Even his attendants weren't allowed to touch them. They carried them with long sticks, letting the sandals hover slightly above the ground. You blink. Sandals that weren't supposed to touch the ground? Yes. And you'll see those tomorrow. You wake to the sound of palms swaying and a faint whisper of tide brushing up against lava rock. Still barefoot, still quiet. Someone hands you a piece of sweetened taro wrapped in Thai leaf. It's breakfast, kind of. And your guide, a wiry elder, with calm eyes and calloused hands, motions for you to follow inland, away from the beach and toward the old Ali'i compound. The path curves uphill through kukui groves, and the air cools slightly. You're warned again. No pointing. Not at the ridge, not at the compound, and definitely not at the carved stones by the entrance. Not because it's rude, but because pointing draws attention. Your attention, and possibly unwanted spiritual attention as well. As you round the bend, you finally glimpse them. The slippers. 2 of them. Resting side by side on a woven mat inside an open-air platform. Not touching the earth. Not worn. These are replicas, your guide says, but modeled after surviving descriptions and fragments. Royal sandals from the pre-contact era. When the Ali'i walked with the manna of gods, they're delicate, strangely so. Not the kind of footwear you'd want to hike a volcano in. Braided from Alona fibers, stronger than hemp, tougher than they look. But it's not the construction that strikes you, it's the plumage. Yellow and red feathers sewn carefully into the upper sole, fanning outward in a subtle arc. They're not flamboyant. They're sacred. The Ali'i didn't wear these while fishing or harvesting or walking through town. These were for ritual moments, arrival ceremonies, blessings, funeral processions. Even then, they were sometimes carried, not worn, as if the sandals themselves were too divine for ground contact. And if you're imagining a chief striding down a sandy lane, sandals flapping cheerfully, you're off. No flapping allowed. In fact, most of the time, high chiefs traveled via litter, borne on the shoulders of attendants, while their feathered slippers were carried beside them, like one might carry a ceremonial torch or sacred drum. The sandals didn't touch the real ground. Neither did the chief. And you? You'd better not even cast a shadow across that procession. Historians still argue whether these feathered sandals were common across all of Hawaii's islands or reserved only for the highest-ranking Ali'i Kapu, those whose mana was said to burn too bright for ordinary eyes. Some say every major island had its own version, some with feathers, others with dogtooth accents or woven bark fiber embellishments. Others argue that the feathered design was rare even among royalty and might have served more as symbols than actual wearables. You lean in to examine one of the replicas more closely. The feathers look familiar, and they should. Many came from birds known as o'o and mamo, both now extinct. You feel a twinge of modern guilt, but your guide shakes his head gently. We didn't kill them for feathers, he says. We trapped, plucked, released. Pause. Mostly. It's a complicated truth, like many things here. Feather gathering was a respected trade. Whole families passed down the knowledge of how to find and net the birds without harming them. Still, some of the more prized colors, particularly the bright yellow, were so rare that even a single royal cape might require feathers from tens of thousands of birds. The sandals? Just a few hundred. Still extravagant. still not for walking. So here's a funny thing. The most prestigious slippers in the land were often never used for their obvious purpose. You try to imagine that in modern terms. A sneaker drop where the shoes are too holy to wear. Imagine some streetwear collector reverently placing Jordans in a crystal case and then praying to them. Not far off, honestly. There's a certain cheeky poetry in it. The ultimate form of respect for the land was not walking on it, at least, not directly. The alliés, through their footwear or their refusal to use it, demonstrated not just status, but a kind of humility. Albeit a very stylized, feather-laden humility, you're reminded of something your guide mentioned offhandedly. How, in some places, even the act of tying the sandals was considered beneath the chief's dignity. Attendants would do it, using special implements, hooks and sticks, never hands, to avoid physical contact. Sandals weren't worn out of necessity, they were deployed like sacred tools. And if that seems exaggerated, think of it this way. These weren't just shoes. They were vessels of mana, physical proof of divine connection. In ancient Hawaii, where spirituality infused every act from fishing to fighting, your feet didn't just carry your body, they carried your essence. And the ali'i, their essence was fire. Still, some days, the rules got flexible. There's an old story your guide shares about a chief who tried walking through a muddy taro patch in his feathered sandals. The attendants freaked out, the feathers got ruined, and supposedly, the sandals were buried in shame. Whether it's true or not, you can't help but picture it. Plumage matted with mud, and a very sheepish-looking ali'i wiping his feet on a banana leaf. But no one laughs out loud. Even the joke, in this context, feels respectful, reverent. The kind of laughter you save for family stories at twilight. The sun's rising higher now, casting soft lines through the trees. You glance down at your own feet again, dusty, unadorned, but somehow more aware, like they're listening, like they understand something new. The feathered sandals on the mat haven't moved, of course. They'll never touch this soil. And in that stillness, you feel it again, that fine tension between power and restraint. A slipper not walked in, a path not trodden, a rule not broken, all woven together in silence and fiber and feathers. You follow your guide deeper into the compound, where the stone platforms rise like quiet reminders of authority. Here, the air thickens, not with heat, but with the weight of rules, and not just the obvious ones. You're about to learn something that might wrinkle your brow. You couldn't just look at certain sandals, not if they belong to someone truly sacred. You see, ancient Hawaiian society revolved around kapu, a deeply ingrained set of spiritual laws that governed everything from where you could stand to how you could cook your dinner. And when it came to the aleurai and their belongings, kapu wasn't just a concept, it was a full-time job to keep up with. That includes the curious case of forbidden footwear. The higher the rank, the stricter the kapu. Some sandals weren't just footwear, they were considered extensions of the person's divine status, which meant that merely gazing upon them, especially if you weren't properly prepared, could bring misfortune. Death in the older stories. Sickness if the gods were feeling generous. So imagine you're a commoner walking along a dusty trail and a royal procession is about to pass. You'd be expected to lie flat, face down in the dirt, eyes shut. Not because you're being punished, but because proximity to that much mana, spiritual power, was simply too much. You'd risk being scorched by it, like staring at the sun, too long, and those sandals, they were like glowing coals of that energy, braided with the authority of generations. Historians still debate the exact severity of these rules. Some argue that only the highest ali'i nui were subject to such extreme reverence, while others believe the strictness varied between islands and generations. What's agreed upon is this: these weren't just cultural quirks, these were existential truths enforced with the same certainty as gravity. You pass a small display of tools, long-handled hooks, soft brushes, little gourds of oil. These weren't for agriculture. They were grooming implements, many of them for the care and maintenance of sacred clothing, including those ornate feathered slippers. Cleaning them was a ritual in itself. One wrong move, one unworthy touch, and the sandals might need to be re-blessed or even burned. And yes, there were officials tasked with this. A whole cadre of attendants whose sole duty was to tend to the bodily needs of the ali'i without ever compromising spiritual safety. Footwear maintenance was part of that role. Think of them like the royal stylists of the kapu system. Except instead of dealing with red carpet mishaps, they were managing life or death contact protocols. There's an odd comfort in how detailed it all was. In a world of volcano gods and shark spirits, you might feel safer knowing that someone had a checklist for how to hold a sacred sandal. Now here's a particularly quirky bit. Some royal sandals were believed to act as spiritual proxies. If a chief couldn't attend a ceremony, his sandals might be placed in his stead, faced properly, flanked with offerings, attended as though he were physically present. It's sort of like sending a cardboard cutout of yourself to a party, except infused with ancestral energy and watched by chanting priests. You pause to think about how much meaning could be wrapped around something so ordinary. In most cultures, shoes are practical, or at best fashionable. In ancient Hawaii, they were a line between worlds. You didn't just wear them, you respected them. You feared them. In rare cases, you even worshipped them. Which makes the next detail even stranger. Some oral traditions suggest that, in certain rituals, sandals were temporarily unbraided, taken apart, strand by strand, and then re-woven after a prayer or blessing had been completed, as if the act of undoing the sandal made its spiritual energy easier to release. A kind of ritual exhale. These accounts are harder to verify, and historians still argue whether they describe common practice or symbolic storytelling. Still, this image sticks with you. A sandal unraveling like a spider's web, each strand carrying a different thread of history. Back outside the platform, you notice the sun is high now, and the light dances across the tops of banana trees. Your guide offers you a drink of cool awa, a mildly numbing root brew, while you sit under a thatched awning and think about shoes. Not much walking today. That's the point. Suddenly, the idea of barefoot reverence makes sense. In this culture, touching the ground wasn't just about friction, it was about relationship. Who you were in the cosmic order. The land wasn't property, it was ancestor. Wearing feathered sandals to tread on it casually would be like using your grandma's quilt as a doormat. You stretch your toes in the soil and wonder how often ancient Hawaiians thought about feet. Probably more than we do. Where they stepped, who they followed, what they carried. All encoded into footwear rituals so precise they'd make a Swiss watch blush. And just as you're starting to drift into that sleepy late morning daze, your guide breaks the silence with a single phrase. Even shadows followed rules. You blink. He smiles, but he's not joking. That story's coming next. You're still sitting under that awning, the taste of the hour just starting to dull the edges of your mouth when your guide's words echo again. Even shadows followed rules. You furrow your brow slightly, not sure if you misheard or if the root brew is stronger than expected. But no, he's already gesturing for you to follow, past the main platform, to a shaded grove where the trees arch overhead like quiet onlookers. Now, let's get this straight. In ancient Hawaiian society, the kapu system wasn't just about what you could eat or wear. It extended to the metaphysical, yes, even to your shadow. For commoners, passing too close to a high-ranking chief wasn't just risky. Letting your shadow touch theirs. That was often grounds for immediate punishment. You didn't need to speak out of turn or lift a hand in rebellion. Just your body casting shade in the wrong direction was enough to violate sacred order. Your shadow was considered an extension of your mana, your spiritual essence. So if your shadow, your messy, flailing, unavoidable shadow, dared to overlap with that of a divine chief, it was essentially your soul intruding where it didn't belong. You might as well have slapped a god with a sandal. Historians still argue whether these punishments were universal across all the islands or reserved only for encounters with the most sacred individuals, like the Alihai Kapu o Lono. Some accounts speak of shadow taboo violations leading to swift execution by warriors. Others suggest that when spirits were feeling merciful, or the violator was young or elderly, the offender might be spared but ritually cleansed. Either way, it's not a mistake you'd want to make twice. Now imagine walking down a path. You see a royal procession approaching. You dive off the trail, not just to avoid eye contact, but to keep your shadow from slithering into forbidden territory. And if it's cloudy, you're breathing a bit easier. Less light, fewer shadows. More time to exhale. It makes sense then why many ali'i prefer to travel at certain times of day, early morning or dusk, when shadows were long and predictable. There are even chants and songs that reference the long shadow of the High Chief, not in admiration, but in caution, as if to say, beware, it reaches farther than you think. And here's the quirky part. Some chiefs reportedly used shadow bearers. These were attendants who, quite literally, walked in such a way that they could block or redirect the chief's shadow. Think of them as ancient human umbrellas, not for rain, but for spiritual interference. Their task? To ensure no rogue villagers. Shadow would mingle where it wasn't permitted. There are no surviving diagrams, but imagine the choreography involved. You'd need an advanced degree in geometry and a good pair of legs. Some researchers compare this to similar beliefs in parts of Africa, Polynesia, and even Asia, where shadows were believed to contain portions of a person's soul or life force. In all these cultures, manipulating or stepping on someone's shadow wasn't a game. It was warfare. And in Hawaii, it tied directly into footwear too, because shoes weren't just for walking, they were barriers, shields between you and the holy ground, or even between your shadow and another's. Your guide pauses to let that settle, then points to a patch of smoothed volcanic rock. Now imagine, he says, being the sandal maker who had to account for both the foot and the shadow. You blink again, unsure if he's serious, but here's the thing. Sandals weren't always symmetrical. Some had flared tips, woven flaps, or side frills not for function, but possibly to cast a particular kind of outline on the ground. It's speculative, of course. This is the fringe part. No one has a papyrus scroll titled How to Craft Sandals for optimum shadow conduct. But there are oral histories that mention certain ali'i refusing to wear sandals that didn't sit right with the sun. Was it about appearance or aura? Historians still argue. Regardless, the attention to shadow and step was intense. Ceremonies often involved coordinated walking sequences, stepping with the right foot first, turning at specific angles, slowing one's pace so the shadow wouldn't leap ahead and make contact too soon. It's like watching spiritual traffic control. And speaking of walking, there were also kapu zones, entire sections of land where no shoes could be worn at all, not even by royalty. These places, often heiau, temple sites, or burial groves, were considered so sacred that even the sacred had to tread carefully. Here, the act of removing your sandals wasn't about humility. It was about spiritual neutrality. You weren't royalty or commoner. You were just one speck among countless ancestors. Your guide kicks off his slippers as he enters one of these zones. You follow, the soil warm underfoot, soft with decaying leaves. The air feels heavier, still, as if the trees are waiting for something. You whisper without meaning to. Did they ever just forget? He chuckles, then shrugs. If they did, he says, someone always remembered for them. A low, amused answer. But it sticks with you, because now you're thinking about the weight of each step. Not metaphorically, like your carbon footprint or whatever, but literally. The spiritual geometry of moving through the world without offending it. That's how much care went into footwear, and shadows, and the invisible line between both. You're still barefoot, following your guide across a stretch of dark soil, the scent of rain-soaked bark and iron-rich dirt curling into your nose. The canopy above has thinned just enough to let shafts of sun cut through, casting those same shadows you've just learned to tiptoe around. And right there, beneath a tangle of how trees, he points to a sun-bleached frame of icy vine, roughly sandal-shaped. This, he says, was not for walking. Not really. Tonight, we're talking ceremonial sandals, the pairs that were worn not across lava fields or fishing trails, but across metaphysical thresholds. You didn't lace these up to run errands or visit your cousin down by the fish pond. These were purpose-built, sacred objects, woven with intent, chanted over, and sometimes never actually worn at all. Let's start with this. Ceremonial sandals, often referred to as kama'a kapu, had more in common with reliquaries than modern shoes. Some were never meant to touch the earth. Others were worn only once, during the installation of a new ali'inui, or in the final rituals of a funeral procession. Think of them like crowns, or robes of state, except for your feet. Many were made from aini aerial roots, a woody vine that twisted its way through the forest canopy, tough and flexible. The choice of aini wasn't just practical. The plant was sacred to Laka, goddess of hula and forest growth, and was often harvested with chants and offerings. So yes, your royal sandals may have started as a prayer. Here's a fascinating twist. Some of these ceremonial pairs included tufts of iwa bird feathers, shark teeth inlays, or even minute scraps of copper cloth dyed red, a color strictly reserved for the most divine chiefs. The symbolism here ran deep. Feathers for spiritual elevation, shark teeth for dominion over land and sea, red copper for pure, undiluted mana. Wearing such sandals wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a public reminder of your cosmic resume. Historians still debate whether all these embellishments were functional. Wouldn't shark teeth hurt your feet? Possibly. But then again, some scholars believe these additions weren't placed on the sole, but worked into the strap or upper rim. Visible, symbolic, but not meant to be stepped on. Others argue that for one-time rituals, comfort wasn't the point. You might wince through a ceremony, but you'd look unforgettable doing it. Now let's look at one of the oddest traditions tied to ceremonial sandals, the act of not wearing them at all. According to some oral histories from Molokai, a chief might commission a pair of kapu kama'a, bless them with his name and genealogy, and then never slip his feet into them. Instead, the sandals would be carried behind him during certain rituals, sometimes placed on an elevated stone platform near the entrance of a heiau. Why? Because the sandals were considered an extension of the self. By placing them somewhere sacred, the chief was making a spiritual offering without sacrificing his own body. A loophole, if you will, in the great divine tax code. Sometimes ceremonial sandals were buried with their wearer. Other times, they were stored in hailpahu, sacred storage houses treated with the same reverence as ancestral bones, or carved ki'i images. If the sandals belonged to a particularly revered leader, they might even be kept by the next generation of chiefs, not to wear, but to honor. Like inheriting someone's battle helmet, even if you never planned to ride into war. There's also one surviving legend, possibly metaphorical, possibly rooted in reality, about a chiefess on Kauai whose ceremonial sandals were said to hum during certain ceremonies. That's right. As in, emit a low vibrating sound that coincided with chanting. Now, is this poetic flourish? A storyteller's exaggeration? Or could the weaving of certain fibers, combined with tight tension and rhythmic movement, actually produce a faint sound when struck by wind or feet? Historians still argue. Regardless, the point is this. In ancient Hawaii, your ceremonial sandals were not just gear. They were biography. They were statement. They were spells braided into souls. And just like the modern dilemma of what to wear to a wedding versus what to wear to the grocery store, Ali'i too had their wardrobe challenges. Only in this case, the dress code could determine whether you left a ritual spiritually uplifted or cosmically disrespected. Now, imagine you're there. It's pre-dawn. A line of torchbearers lights the stone path. You stand at the edge of a heiau platform, waiting for the signal. On your feet are ceremonial sandals that took 6 moon cycles to make. You don't know whether to feel powerful or very, very nervous. The straps feel too tight. The soles creak against the stone. Somewhere behind you, a priest is chanting your ancestors' names. You take your first step forward. Not onto stone, but onto woven mats. Soft, welcoming. The symbolism is rich. You are stepping onto the legacy of those who came before, carefully laid beneath your feet. And there it is again. The power of footwear. Not to elevate, not to protect, but to announce one foot, then the other. Silence, except for the flicker of torches and the soft scrape of imy root against reed. You've just crossed a line. And every step forward? A reminder that even royalty needed something underfoot to keep the heavens steady above. You wake the next morning to the sound of palm fronds swaying above you, the air thick with sea salt and early sunlight. Your guide greets you with a grin and a woven satchel under his arm. Today, he says, we talk about who gets to wear shoes and who definitely doesn't. In ancient Hawaiian society, footwear wasn't a free-for-all. Not everyone got to slip on a pair of sandals and stroll around like they owned the island. Quite the opposite. In fact, sandals weren't just about convenience. They were a social lightning rod, a visible signal of who you were, and more. Importantly, who you were not. You start to notice something odd as you journey through the village. Nearly everyone is barefoot. Farmers, fishers, children sprinting between canoe hulls, even some mid-level kahuna. Not a single sandal in sight. Why? Because in many cases, wearing sandals when you shouldn't was a big deal. As in, the gods might notice big. In highly stratified Hawaiian society, the kapu system regulated just about everything. What you could eat, where you could walk, and yes, what you could wear. And under this system, footwear was a symbol of elevated rank. The ali'i, especially the ali'i nui, wore sandals as a sign of their sacred status. Their feet, which carried divine mana, needed to be protected not just from sharp rocks, but from contact with the regular world. A bare royal foot touching common ground could theoretically desecrate either the land or the person standing nearby. You see the problem. So, to avoid all that metaphysical awkwardness, the solution was sandals, often carried by attendants and sometimes placed on the ground before the chief walked. Yes, like a red carpet you could reuse. Meanwhile, if you were a commoner and tried to make your own sandals just to copy the look, let's just say you wouldn't need them for long. Historical sources and oral traditions suggest harsh penalties for anyone who violated sandal-related kapu. In some cases, the offense wasn't about the sandals themselves, but the implication. A commoner in royal-style sandals was seen as a threat, not to fashion, but to the entire cosmic order. Historians still argue whether these social rules were uniformly enforced across all islands. Kauai, for instance, had slightly more independent traditions than Hawaii Island, and it's unclear if the sandal taboos were quite as rigid there. What we do know is that in many cases, the visual absence of footwear was as much a message as its presence. Now here's the quirky part. There were reverse taboos too. Just as some people were forbidden from wearing sandals, others were forbidden from being seen by sandal-wearing chiefs. If a sacred chief approached, certain. Individuals, particularly menstruating women or those in mourning, were expected to remove themselves entirely from the path. In rare cases, even dogs were required to be cleared from ceremonial walkways, lest they interfere with the mana of the feet. So yes, even Fido had to observe the dress code. In fact, some legends suggest that when chiefs traveled, entire paths were cleared hours in advance by heralds shouting the approaching rank, giving people time to hide, bow, or clear the ground completely. And this wasn't just symbolic. A sandal-wearing chief's mana was considered intensely active while moving. Every step was a kind of blessing, or a curse, depending on your proximity and eligibility. Now, let's take a moment to picture one such procession. You're on Maui, maybe around 1680. The ali'i nui is traveling to a seaside heiau. Word has gone ahead. The crowd has thinned. On his feet are kama'a lauhala, woven pandana sandals, dyed with olena turmeric and lined with rare kapa. Ahead of him, attendants scatter flower petals and chant his genealogy. And then, drama. An elderly woman fails to clear the path in time. She doesn't see him coming. She's half blind. The sandals pause. Now, what happens next depends on the version of the story. Some say the chief stopped, stepped aside, and spoke gently, an act remembered for generations. Others claim she was removed from the area and required purification, rites for accidental mana contact. Either way, you start to understand. These sandals didn't just carry feet, they carried power, risk, consequence. Wearing them wasn't a comfort, it was a responsibility. Another curious social quirk. Children of high-ranking chiefs didn't automatically get sandal privileges. They had to earn them, usually through a rite of passage or a public recognition of rank. Until then, even a future king might be barefoot and dusty, indistinguishable from the kid chasing pigs through the taro patch. It's a reminder that, in ancient Hawaii, feet told stories. Whose feet were covered? Whose were bare? Whose left no trace at all? Of course, like all social systems, the kapu structure surrounding sandals began to shift over time. By the late 18th century, as contact with European explorers and traders increased, Hawaiians began encountering leather shoes, boots, and metal buckles, objects that weren't just alien, but hilariously impractical on lava and sand. Some ali'i tried them. Most found them ridiculous. There's a reason you don't wear hard soles on a canoe deck. Still, some did begin to adapt. King Kamehameha I, for example, was occasionally seen in hybrid footwear that mixed traditional materials with foreign designs. But even then, sandals remained symbolic, especially in rituals. The barefoot fisherman might eye those royal soles with a mix of awe and silent rebellion. After all, shoes can mark a man's rank, or the exact spot where his feet once stood. So tonight, as you imagine the thud of sandal against stone, the whisper of woven fiber against earth, remember, in this world, to wear shoes was to be seen, and to go barefoot. That was either humility or survival. And if you ever find yourself time traveling to ancient Hawaii, here's a pro tip. Before you slip on those sandals you made from palm bark and ambition, double check your genealogy. Or you might find yourself very politely uninvited from the ceremony. The sun is high again, and your feet are starting to understand why so many people in ancient Hawaii went barefoot. The black lava paths are hot enough to cook taro cakes on, and even the shady trails offer little relief. Your guide hands you a folded cloth soaked in cool water and chuckles. Now imagine doing this in sandals made of bark cloth. You've now entered the stage of this curious journey where footwear isn't just about rank, it's about ritual. The spiritual dimension of Hawaiian sandals runs deeper than their material, deeper even than their kapu status. And tonight, your mind drifts into the quieter, stranger corners of sacred practice, where shoes weren't just worn, they were offered. Let's start with a rarely told ritual, the cleansing of the path. Before major events, especially anything involving the highest-ranking ali'i, specialists known as kahuna pule, prayer priests, would walk the ceremonial route barefoot, chanting and scattering salt or sweet-smelling herbs like ale or iliahi. But in some traditions, they would also carry sandals as offerings, either laid at crossroads or placed at shrines along the path. Why? Because the sandals themselves were considered stand-ins for the chief's presence. Leaving them behind symbolized safe passage, divine approval, or a kind of footprint without the foot, a metaphysical RSVP. In one chant preserved from Molokai, there's even a line that roughly translates to, "The foot goes not, but its shape blesses the stone." Poetic, slightly cryptic, deeply Hawaiian. And don't be surprised if you're now wondering, wait, were sandals ever burned as offerings? Yes, sometimes. Particularly during funerals of powerful ali'i, when attendants would gather not just leis and kapa cloaks, but also the deceased sandals, especially if they were ritually significant or had touched sacred ground. In fact, burning the sandals was believed to release their mana, allowing the essence of the wearer's journey to join the ancestors. Historians still argue whether this was practiced on all islands or mostly confined to religious centers like Pu'uhonua or Honaunau on the Big Island. But the idea that your sandals could carry your spirit with them, that was very real. And speaking of carrying mana, have you ever heard of kapu footpaths? These were routes that only the most sacred figures could walk, sometimes worn smooth by generations, sometimes hidden in dense forest, almost invisible to the outsider. Stepping on them uninvited, especially with covered feet, could bring disaster, or at least a stern talking to by a local priest. Even more intriguing, some of these paths were considered spirit roads, routes believed to be used by the souls of the dead. Sandals weren't just banned here, they were antithetical. One story from Lanai tells of a warrior who returned from battle wearing the sandals of a defeated chief. Proud of his trophy, he walked the wrong trail and was found the next day, sandals missing, eyes wide open, heart stopped. Coincidence? Maybe. But even today, elders on some islands warn children not to walk certain trails at night, especially not with shoes, they'll say. You might step on someone you can't see. Another layer to this, sandals in healing rituals. Surprising? Yes, but not unheard of. In some villages, if a person was plagued by unexplained illness, what we might call bad luck and what they might call disrupted mana. A healer might place specially prepared sandals at the foot of their sleeping mat. These were not worn, but rather acted as spiritual decoys, absorbing negative energy overnight. In the morning, they'd be cast into the sea or buried near a breadfruit tree. You picture it now? Lying in a woven hail, moonlight streaming through the roof slats, the faint scent of kukui oil in the air, and at the edge of your mat, a pair of ghost-catching slippers. Of course, these rituals weren't documented in Western journals. They come to us in chants, family stories, and the careful retellings of cultural practitioners. And not everyone agrees on the details. Historians still debate whether these decoy sandals were tied to older Polynesian traditions or unique to certain Hawaiian villages. But the thread remains: footwear as a spiritual proxy. Even sandals that weren't used ritually often had symbolic designs. Some had triangle motifs woven into the straps, meant to represent shark teeth, royal ancestry, or both. Others were dyed with turmeric or uki pigments, especially those intended for weddings, naming ceremonies, or seasonal feasts. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. In one preserved oral tradition, a mischievous younger brother of a minor chief on Oahu swapped out ceremonial sandals with a pair made of seaweed and turtle shell just before a feast. The result? A loud squelch with every sacred step, and a deeply confused priest. It became a village joke for years. Even today, the phrase, "don't seaweed your sandals," survives in some communities as a gentle warning not to tamper with things above your rank. So, as the sun slips lower and the island cools around you, think about all the feet that have crossed this ground. Some left marks in the sand, some left sandals at shrines, some walked barefoot for a lifetime, not because they lacked shoes, but because the shoes were too sacred to wear. And when you wake tomorrow, you might just find a fresh pair of woven soles outside your door, left by your guide. They won't be for fashion, they'll be for respect. Just don't wear them on the spirit trail. Your ankles ache, your calves protest, and your brain is beginning to feel delightfully foggy, like mist creeping down a jungle slope. That's probably the perfect mindset for where we're headed next, the realm of footwear taboos. You've already glimpsed a few kapu rules along this journey, but now it's time to really explore what not to wear, or more importantly, what not to do with what you wear. Let's get one thing out of the way. Shoes weren't something the average Hawaiian person spent much time thinking about. Most people went barefoot unless ceremony or social standing required otherwise. But for the alii class, and especially for their attendants, priests, and kin, footwear behavior was governed by rules that could make modern fashion week look like a pajama party. Take, for instance, the practice of removing sandals before entering sacred spaces. Sounds simple, right? But in ancient Hawaii, Sacred space didn't just mean temples or shrines. It could be a rock imbued with ancestral mana, a ceremonial, canoe, or even a person, particularly if they were high-ranking or newly consecrated. Stepping too close or failing to remove your sandals in time could be taken as an insult or a spiritual threat. Some stories say sandals were not only removed, but turned upside down at the threshold of a space, symbolizing the surrender of ego and authority. Kind of like saying, "I come in peace, and I'll try not to track in any cosmic debris." Historians still argue whether this practice was universal or localized to priestly circles. What's clearer is that even touching certain sandals could be taboo. A sandal worn by a reigning chief, for example, might be considered an extension of the body. That meant a commoner, even a noble of lower rank, risked punishment for handling it without permission. And by punishment, we don't mean a scolding. Sometimes it meant exile. Other times, it meant serving in silence for months, like that poor attendant from Maui who accidentally tripped over his chief's sandals and had to spend an entire season chanting apologies to a river rock. Another unusual taboo: wearing the wrong sandal on the wrong foot, if the sandals were ritually assigned. In cases where a pair had symbolic left-right distinctions, say one tied to the sun, the other to the moon, reversing them was believed to bring imbalance. One priestly chant speaks of a warrior who crossed the steps of light and shadow and was struck with illness. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe his sandals were just on backward. There's also the matter of passing sandals down through family lines. You might think, how sweet, a generational pair of flip-flops. But not so fast. While some sacred sandals were carefully preserved and passed down, others were deliberately destroyed upon the owner's death. Why? Because footwear could carry mana, spiritual energy, especially if worn during rituals or major life events. Keeping them around was like keeping a charged battery under your pillow. And even today, some Hawaiian families quietly follow the old practice of burning or burying shoes after the loss of a loved one. It's not superstition, it's respect. A quiet way of saying, "You've walked far enough." Now, let's drift towards something even more curious: gendered sandal taboos. Certain types of woven patterns were considered inappropriate for women to wear during specific lunar phases, particularly during kapu nights when spiritual energy was believed to shift. Likewise, men participating in rituals involving birth or fertility were sometimes required to go barefoot, even if they were high-ranking, lest their sandals interrupt the balance of creation. One chant from Kauai even mentions a sandal, style reserved for midwives, made from hala fibers and decorated with tiny shells. Historians still debate whether this was symbolic or functional, but the idea remains: sandals could speak for your role. Wear the wrong pair, and the land might not listen. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. There are whispers of an ancient punishment known as walking the long line. This involved an offending person, usually a noble who'd broken a kapu, being forced to walk barefoot along a trail lined with discarded sandals from fallen chiefs. The idea was not only physically punishing, lava rocks anyone, but deeply spiritual. You were retracing the steps of those who'd failed before you, literally stepping where shame once stood. It's debated whether this ritual actually occurred, or if it's the poetic invention of later storytellers. But it survives in oral tradition, and if enough aunties tell you the same story with that same sideways smile, who are you to doubt? Oh, and speaking of sideways smiles, let's not forget the secret codes embedded in sandal wear. Certain knots or strap styles were believed to signal messages, like whether someone was single, whether they just completed a rite of passage, or whether they were actively tapu and not to be touched or spoken to. Kind of like wearing a mood ring. But for your feet, one surviving sandal from a cave on Hawaii Island appears to have a twist in the heel cord, possibly signifying that its wearer was in between roles or in a period of transition. Was it a priest becoming a chief? A chief giving up rank? No one knows. But that one twist in a length of cord has kept archaeologists guessing for decades. And if that isn't the perfect metaphor for ancient Hawaiian footwear, what is? So tonight, as you lie there drifting deeper into sleep, try to imagine a world where every step is watched by the gods, where even your shoes carry stories, and where a misstep could alter not just your path, but your spiritual balance. And maybe, just maybe, consider turning your slippers upside down before bed, just in case. You stir in your mental hammock, the kind slung between two imaginary palm trees. Your toes wiggle under the blanket, maybe without you even noticing, as we slide now into the world of craftsmanship and makers, those unsung artisans who turned leaves, bark, bone, and time into status symbols for the feet. We're talking about the kahuna kapalalima, craftspeople whose job wasn't just to make footwear, but to infuse it with meaning, mana, and sometimes a splash of quiet rebellion. In ancient Hawaii, crafting anything, be it a canoe or a sandal, wasn't just a matter of having the right materials. It was a sacred act, bound by ritual and technique. Sandal making, though more modest in prestige than, say, building a double-hulled voyaging canoe, still required a trained hand. You couldn't just pluck some lohala leaves and call it a day. The process began with selecting the right plant, materials. Pandanus leaves, for instance, weren't just gathered, they were prepared. Stripped, dried, softened, and sometimes dyed using natural pigments. And that's if you were working with leaves. Thai leaves, olona bark, and even coconut. Husk fibers were other popular choices, depending on the region and purpose. The rarest sandals, those made with human hair or feather inlays, reserved for only the highest chiefs and thought to connect the wearer more deeply with ancestral spirits. Here's a juicy tidbit. One strand of oral tradition says that some sandal makers deliberately embedded hidden messages into the weave patterns, a private language of knots and loops meant to honor ancestors, tell genealogies, or quietly protest political decisions. Like ancient footnotes, literally underfoot. Historians still argue whether this kind of subtextual weaving was widespread or reserved for the most esoteric of artisans. Skeptics point out that no codebooks exist. Believers counter that oral cultures didn't need them. Regardless, what's certain is that sandal making was a gendered skill in some districts and unisex in others. On Molokai, for instance, women were known to specialize in the more decorative styles, especially those used in hula ceremonies. Meanwhile, on Hawaii Island, men dominated the craft when the sandals were for warriors or priests. And you didn't just make a sandal and hand it off. You presented it, often with a chant, a breath of prayer, or even a test walk performed under the gaze of elders or a family spirit idol, aumakua. These weren't mass-produced flip-flops. These were tailored emblems of identity. Interestingly, some sandal makers were itinerant, traveling from village to village and making footwear in exchange for food, lodging, or protection. These roving artisans were often keepers of obscure weaving techniques. Think of them like the traveling tattoo artists of the day, but with rope and plant fiber. And just like today's tattoo subculture, there was always that one person known to have the real stuff. You might be wondering, how long did a pair last? Well, it depends. Everyday sandals for a lesser chief might last a few months, especially if worn during wet seasons or lava trekking. But ceremonial pairs, worn rarely and stored carefully, might survive for years. A few fragments still exist today, preserved. In dry caves and museum drawers, their fibers faded but unmistakably handwoven. Now, let's zoom in on one particularly mysterious style, the so-called ghost heel sandal. Named by modern scholars, not ancient Hawaiians, these were sandals where the heel portion was deliberately left unbound, essentially allowing the back of the foot to touch the earth. Some believe this was to maintain spiritual grounding, allowing mana to flow between the body and the land even while partially shod. Others argue it was purely functional, quicker drying, less chafing. But come on, these are Hawaiians we're talking about. Form and function were rarely separated. You can still hear a modern Hawaiian auntie sigh and say, "Something's gotta breathe, honey, even your feet." Craftspeople often passed their skills down through tight-knit families, using chants to memorize complicated weaving patterns. One recorded chant from the 19th century outlines every step of a sandal's construction, from cutting to binding, and is said to be so soothing that some use it as a lullaby. If you're wondering whether I considered singing it to you, don't worry, I've been told I sound like a tired mongoose when I try. Let's drift to one final little known fact. Some sandal makers gifted their creations to the sea. Before, big transitions, like the birth of a child, a seasonal migration, or the construction of a new heiau temple, they'd craft a symbolic sandal and send it floating out with the tide, carrying prayers and intentions. Occasionally, these sandals were found by other communities, and stories would be told about where they came from, like bottled messages in a braided footwear form. So tonight, imagine yourself at the edge of the Pacific, weaving soft strips of leaf into something that isn't just meant to be worn, but meant to speak. The hush of the ocean brushes your skin. The moonlight picks out the delicate textures in your work. And as you finish your final knot, you whisper a name, maybe your own, and set it gently on the waves. Somewhere far off, the sea answers. Your eyes are heavier now. Your limbs are more relaxed. You're not quite asleep, but it wouldn't take much. Maybe just a few more steps, soft, deliberate ones, on ancient lava rock. Tonight, you're walking beside a high-ranking alii, and you're watching the way the world reacts to their footsteps. Because Section 10 is all about rituals of movement. Those curious, layered practices that governed how alii walked, where they walked, and who was allowed to be anywhere near their sandals when they did. Now, you'd think walking was simple, one foot, then the other. But for Hawaiian royalty, it was anything but casual. An alii of high rank didn't just stroll down the beach. They glided, arrived, or were carried. Their steps were often part of a choreographed moment, especially during major ceremonies, seasonal rites, or visits between districts. Let's say you're observing a procession to a sacred site. You'd likely see sandal bearers up front, those attendants we met earlier, followed by kahuna, priests chanting, and behind them, the alii themselves, possibly walking barefoot or wearing the specially crafted ceremonial sandals we talked about in Section 9. Every pause, every turn, every step was meaningful. One tradition that might puzzle your modern sensibilities? The taboo trail, a path sanctified for alii use only, cleared of all people, animals, and even shadows. In some cases, if you were caught crossing it at the wrong time, you were, well, probably not going to finish your lunch or your week. But again, this isn't a horror story, it's a sleep story. So we'll keep it gentle and remind ourselves that mana, the spiritual energy that saturates everything, was a two-way street. Alii were powerful, but also deeply responsible for channeling and protecting that power. Walking in sacred spaces wasn't just a rite, it was a burden. This brings us to one of the more curious foot rituals, sand imprint readings. According to oral traditions from certain districts, attendants or priests would study the alii's footprints in soft sand after a ceremony, interpreting the depth, shape, and direction like a celestial map. A wide stance could signal confidence or tension. A shallow imprint might mean spiritual lightness, or maybe that they were just wearing their favorite thin-soled sandals. Historians still argue whether these readings were widespread or limited to a few particularly interpretive kahuna. But some 19th century missionary accounts mention strange rituals with the feet, and even note that some alii believed bad omens could be caught in the heel if they walked too soon after a solar eclipse. That one makes you pause, doesn't it? Imagine holding back your royal entrance because the moon's having a moment. Another little-known tradition, rainfoot blessings. These were simple but potent rituals, especially practiced on Oahu and Maui. If it rained unexpectedly during a ceremonial journey, the alii would pause, remove their sandals, and let the rain fall directly onto their bare feet. This was seen as a divine cleansing, manna washing down from the sky to meet the manna rising from the land, with your feet as the bridge. Your sandals would then be placed in a specific pattern on a mat or stone to dry, never tossed or hung. 1. Elderly Kumuhula once joked that alii sandals had more manners than most people today. She's not wrong. There's also the practical but symbolic matter of removing footwear before entering sacred enclosures. Whether it was a heiau, a chiefly residence, or even a canoe reserved for ritual voyages. This wasn't just about keeping the floors clean. It was a mark of deference, a physical acknowledgement that the ground you were about to touch was charged, storied, maybe even watching you back. Fun side note, some ali'i were known to own sandals specifically designed to come off easily mid-step. Imagine walking in a procession, reaching a threshold, and the sandals just slide away, as if they know their job is done. No untying, no fumbling. Just one smooth movement, and you're barefoot, spiritually aligned, and still on schedule. Even the act of placing sandals back on had its own rhythm. Some traditions required facing a specific direction, usually toward the sea or toward the nearest mountain peak, while reshotting your royal feet. And during high ceremonies, a chant might accompany this moment, essentially thanking the sandals for their service and inviting them to protect your steps moving forward. Now here's where it gets delightfully obscure. There's an old belief, recorded on Kauai, that if you placed your sandal upside down by accident, it could confuse your ancestors, making them think you tripped or fallen in battle. So sandal bearers had to be meticulous. Every placement, every alignment mattered. Let's drift to one final scene. You're standing behind the ali'i, watching them descend a narrow lava path toward the sea. Each footstep is deliberate. Their sandals are made of tie leaf and feather cord, shimmering faintly in the twilight. As they reach the water's edge, they pause. Not because they're tired, but because this is a moment to be remembered. You realize, with a kind of sleepy awe, that even their footsteps have a protocol, a poetry. Not because they're royal, but because the land itself demands it. Because even the quietest step, in the right context, can be sacred. You wiggle your own feet under the covers. They're not wrapped in tea leaf or carrying any mana that you know of, but still, you kind of get it now. By now, your mind has likely wandered. You're breathing slower, each thought arriving like a quiet tide. But before you drift completely, let's walk a little deeper. This time, into the curious intersection of gender, hierarchy, and sandals. Because not all ali'i wore the same sandals. In fact, not all ali'i even wore sandals at all. In section 11, we step into a space where footwear wasn't just about status. It was about identity, ceremony, and sometimes quiet rebellion. Let's begin with a familiar scene. A formal gathering on a grassy hill in ancient Kauai. You're there, tucked behind a carved wooden post, watching the line of ali'i file in. The men arrive first, most wearing sandals made from braided coconut, fiber or bark cloth. Then the women, many barefoot, some with delicately woven slippers, and a few wearing nothing at all on their feet but anklets of polished shell. This wasn't neglect or a lack of status, it was deliberate. Among high-ranking women, especially sacred ones known as ali'i kapu wahine, going barefoot was often a mark of heightened mana. Their touch was considered so powerful, so spiritually charged, that even the land needed to brace for it. Sandals, in their case, weren't always a shield. They were sometimes a filter, a dampener. And so, to go without them was to fully, freely connect. Now, that's not to say women never wore sandals, but their designs tended to be more intricate, often featuring decorative knots or dyed fibers. In one oral tradition from Hilo, there's mention of a queenly slipper made from the fibers of aihai vines, incredibly tough yet flexible, and dyed deep red using alea clay. The sandal had no backstrap, which meant it stayed on, only through the precise angle of the wearer's walk. Historians still argue whether this was a daily wear item or reserved for ceremonies. Some think it was purely symbolic, meant to show that a true ali'i wahine never stumbles, that she could keep her footing with elegance, even when gravity did its best to interrupt. Then there's the curious case of gendered sandal etiquette. In many chiefly gatherings, men and women had designated zones where they could place or remove footwear. A sandal accidentally left on the wrong side could raise eyebrows, or even be interpreted as a flirtatious overture. In one 18th century tale, a young noblewoman named Macaulay left her sandal at the edge of a ceremonial mat. When a visiting chief stepped on it by mistake, it sparked a whirlwind of chants, omens, and an eventual marriage. Kind of a Cinderella situation if the glass slipper came with a curse and a rainstorm. Light-hearted details aside, what we see here is how roles and responsibilities were coded right down to the toes. Warrior chiefs wore sandals only when not fighting. Once on the battlefield, they often preferred to feel the earth directly, citing better balance and a spiritual connection to their ancestors. Female kahuna, on the other hand, were known to wear foot wraps of kapa cloth, often scented with sandalwood or crushed kukui leaves, especially during healing rituals. Not quite sandals, not quite bare. It was a liminal state, just like the work they performed. And in families where rank was inherited unevenly, say a high-ranking woman married to a lower status man, their children might wear different footwear, depending on which side of the lineage they were honoring that day. One particularly fussy genealogy chant refers to the child with one sandal on, a metaphor for someone whose birthright straddled two houses, not quite firmly in either. Of course, not all ali'i followed these customs to the letter. The Yan Oi's famous queen Ka'ahumanu, several centuries later, was known for blending traditional and Western styles of dress, including footwear. She reportedly had sandals imported from Tahiti with dyed feathers and pearl inlay, which she wore while still, insisting on traditional kapu during sacred rituals. A subtle act of fashion diplomacy? Or just a woman who liked fancy shoes? Historians still argue, naturally. Here's one last curious tidbit before you let your eyelids drift lower. On the island of Molokai, a rare form of gender-ambiguous sandal was occasionally found in burial caves. These sandals had alternating patterns of knotting, sometimes interpreted as symbolizing duality or balance. Sun and moon, male and female, sea and mountain. Some believe they were worn by mahu, individuals who occupied a third gender or non-binary role in traditional Hawaiian society. If true, it would mean that sandals too had a space for inclusivity, woven quite literally into their form. Now the breeze picks up again. You picture yourself lying back on a woven lauhala mat, toes cooled by the wind, while someone gently retells a genealogy chant nearby. The sandals lie beside you, no longer a burden, but a marker, not of power or privilege, but of presence, of walking your own path with grace. So whether your feet are slippered, bare, or wrapped in metaphor, you carry a lineage all the same. And in this sleepy moment, that's more than enough. The sun is beginning to set now, not just in your imagination, but in the ancient stories we've been walking through. And here, in section 12, you find yourself on a steep, rocky cliff path above the crashing surf of northern Oahu. The light is golden, the sea wind stiff. Your sandals scrape the stone with each step. But these aren't ordinary sandals. These are travel sandals, a specific kind with a very specific reputation. Tonight, we journey into the surprisingly technical world of Hawaiian footwear engineering. Yes, really. You see, Hawaii wasn't just tropical beaches and soft volcanic soil. It was, and is, an archipelago of cliffs, lava fields, dense forests, and sharp coral plains. If you wanted to cross from one valley to another, or hike up to a heiau tucked along a ridgeline, you needed footwear that could hold up. That's where the mo'opalehua comes in. That's the old name for a type of travel sandal with extra toe lashing and double thick soles. The word literally references a footprint of the lizard, a nod perhaps to the mythic mo'o, lizard spirits, said to guard sacred places. But functionally, these sandals were absolute tanks. They were constructed in layers, often a base, of woven hala leaf, stiffened with soaking and sun-drying, then reinforced with Alona fiber cords wrapped in a cross pattern. Some even had a bit of arch support, woven into the sole like a gentle ridge. Your average ali'i or kahuna might commission a pair of these for travel to outer islands or long religious circuits, and you didn't just toss them on. Putting on mo'opalehua was a ritual in itself, like lacing up armor. There are chants specifically for this moment, a rhythmic hum to summon strength and safe passage. Some were even believed to wake the sandal, aligning it to your feet so it wouldn't betray your step in dangerous terrain. Modern scholars are still scratching their heads over exactly how these sandals distributed weight so evenly. Some believe the layered structure acted like a primitive suspension system. Others argue it had more to do with the custom-fit toe lashings, which wrapped around the second and third toes instead of the big toe. An odd but ergonomic choice, especially on steep hillsides. And while we're being nerdy about footwear design, let's talk grip. Some soles had rough textured pebble embeds on the bottom, tiny lava stones braided in. Not exactly hiking boots, but hey, not far off. One 19th century journal from a visiting Tahitian priest even grumbles that the Hawaiian guide walked faster over the cliff than I could descend with both hands and knees, as if his sandals held some magic. Magic, maybe, or just superior biomechanics. Now, let's take a quick detour, because no great piece of gear exists without some drama. According to a tale from Maui's Hana district, a famous runner named Pa'ahe'e once challenged a rival to a yi mountain race. Both wore mo'opalehua, but Pa'ahe'e secretly soaked his sandals in salt water and let them dry in the sun until they stiffened like canoe hulls. The result? He skated down the mountain path like a sled, while his rival stumbled in the dust. Did it actually happen? Historians still argue whether this story is exaggerated, symbolic, or just a bit of friendly ancient trolling. The point is, these sandals weren't one style fits all. Hawaiian terrain demanded variety. On rainy days, travelers wore kapa foot wraps treated with kukui oil to repel moisture. On dry lava plains, single strap sandals were preferred, giving better airflow. And in extreme cases, like volcanic crossings or spiritual isolation rituals, people sometimes wore double-layer sandals with bark padding, making each step sound like a drumbeat on the rock. What's more, sandals were often accompanied by walking sticks, not for support, but for testing the ground. A sharp jab to find loose stone, or even to press back invasive underbrush. One chant describes the pairing as feet and fingers of the mountain traveler. Now remember that mo'o from earlier, the lizard guardians? In some areas, it was considered disrespectful to wear sandals past certain shrines dedicated to these beings. Travelers had to remove them and carry their footwear while chanting softly, announcing their presence. If your foot made a sound, it was seen as a spiritual slip. So yes, these sandals were sturdy. But sometimes, even the best footwear had to come off in reverence. And here's your odd but true tidbit of the night. One small collection of ancient sandals found in a lava tube near Ka'u was discovered, to have tiny olona tassels on the ends, not for decoration, but apparently as makeshift brushes to sweep away your own footprints. A clever way to avoid leaving a trail, or to symbolically erase your passage. Perfect for fugitives or for priests wanting to move unseen between realms. So tonight, as your own feet stretch or curl beneath the blanket, you might imagine slipping on your mo'opalehua. Picture yourself walking over cooled lava, each step a message to the land beneath. The lashing tight, the grip strong. You don't move quickly, but every footfall feels right. And somewhere behind your closed eyelids, you feel the ground change texture, from soil to stone, from stone to something soft. You're nearly home, traveler. You're starting to notice it now, aren't you? The rhythm in every step, the hush between chants, the way the land itself seems to respond to the type of sandal you wear. But don't get too comfortable just yet, because now you're being invited to a place few ever entered, the private compounds of the Alisi, where footwear didn't just matter. It communicated everything. Let's walk together, quietly, past a carved gate woven with pandanus fibers. You're barefoot now because only certain people were allowed to wear sandals here. And even then, only certain types at certain times. Must under certain moons. Sounds excessive. That's because you're not royalty. Tonight, we explore sandal etiquette among the Hawaiian elite and how footwear functioned like a spoken language, if you knew how to read it. You glance down at your feet. Nothing there. That's intentional. In the royal compound, stepping too loudly, even on soft grass, could be interpreted as disrespect. So if you were Ali Yi, you might wear ultralight sandals made of thin copper layers, bleached until nearly white, then dusted with ash to hide your path. This wasn't to protect your feet. This was to make a statement. I walk where others cannot. Now, let's paint a little scene. It's evening. The Ali is sitting beneath a lahua tree, drinking a wai. A messenger arrives from the other side of the island. Before he even speaks, everyone knows the urgency. His sandals have double knots at the toe. That style is only worn by people traveling with sacred news. No one taught this to you, but somehow, everyone just knows. It's part of a broader system of visual codes. Some sandals had small tufts of dyed fiber, blue for sea voyages, red for political missions, green for harvest time messages. Others bore faint geometric stamping along the straps, indicating the wearer's home valley, chiefdom, or spiritual affiliation. And, oh, the scandals. There's a deliciously old tale of a minor noble who dared show up to a wedding ceremony wearing flatland sandals with double arch straps, a style reserved for ranking warriors. One witness claimed the host made him eat raw breadfruit as punishment for the fashion offense. Whether that's historically accurate or just social satire, well, historians still argue whether sandal etiquette was strictly enforced or more symbolic in private contexts. But here's the thing. Footwear rules weren't just about vanity or rank. They served as a kind of walking calendar. For instance, during certain lunar phases, especially around Kanaloa's sacred nights, it was taboo to wear sandals woven from hala. The leaves were believed to hold too much fire energy and could offend the ground. Instead, you'd switch to soft kappa wraps or even go barefoot. Priests would check sandals at temple gates, like bouncers for the gods. And then there were mourning sandals, flat, wide, and colorless. When an Oli died, their retainers wore these for a moon cycle, with minimal binding to signify loosened spiritual ties. They flapped when you walked, producing a ghost-like rustling. Some say it allowed ancestors to recognize your grief from far away. Want one more secret detail? Footwear was sometimes used to signal intent. Let's say a visiting chief arrived at court wearing bark fiber sandals with no side lashing. That meant, I bring no weapons, no threat. But if the same chief showed up in rigid double-layer soles with tucked cords, it was a silent challenge. Tensions could rise before a word was spoken, all because of shoes. Sound familiar? Fashion diplomacy isn't just a modern thing. Now let's get tactile again. Imagine you're helping prepare a set of Ali sandals. You're part of the retainer circle, and you've just spent an hour soaking Alona cords in warm salt water. To soften them, you wrap them in spirals, not knots, because knots are considered spiritually binding, and only the Aliti may command them. Your fingers are sore, but the sandals gleam. The heel strip is inlaid with sandalwood dust, a luxury so prized it was once used as tribute to China. There's even a fun fringe theory, probably nonsense, but entertaining nonetheless, that certain Ali sandals had tiny holes punched in, the sole so their wearers would leave patterns in the sand. Flowers, waves, turtles. A royal version of Kilroy was here. And speaking of fringe things, let's talk about left foot sandal bias. Yes, really. In some chants, the left sandal was considered more spiritually loaded than the right. It was the first to be tied, the last to be removed. Some scholars suggest this symbolized the moon cycle, left preceding the sun, right. Others say it had to do with the heart being slightly to the left, grounding spiritual energy through the same side. Honestly, no one knows. But if you messed up the order in front of a kahuna, you'd probably get a stern side eye. So as you ease into stillness now, picture those layered sandals again. But this time, not on your feet, in your hands. You're holding the story of someone else. Someone who walked through sacred gates with purpose. Someone who knew the weight of every strap, every toe wrap, every footprint. You place the sandals down beside you. You won't be needing them tonight. You're back on the trail, but things feel different now. Slower, softer. Maybe it's because you're finally tuned in, not just to the terrain underfoot, but to all the unspoken signals that ancient Hawaiian sandals once carried. And now, just as your eyelids start to feel a little heavier, you're being led somewhere unexpected, into the world of ceremonial crafting, where sandals weren't merely woven, but birthed through ritual, song, and a peculiar sort of quiet. Engineering. We begin in a hale, a small, low-thatched house tucked along a misty hillside. It smells like wood smoke, damp bark, and awa root. Inside, a master sandal weaver is preparing to teach you. Well, not exactly how to make sandals. That part takes years. No, what you'll learn tonight is something far older. How to listen to the materials. The first lesson? Don't fight the fiber. Whether it's olona, how bark, or braided ti leaves, the rule is the same. Each plant has a rhythm. Olona, for instance, doesn't like to be rushed. You peel it slow, scrape gently with a shell, then leave it overnight with hot stones to make it pliable. This isn't crafting, it's courtship. And the next morning, when you begin your weave, you don't speak. Not out loud. Instead, you hum an old pattern song, a kind of melodic memory that helps you keep the sandal's structure straight. Toe to arch to heel, twist and loop, and breathe. One wrong pull, and the whole pattern shifts. Sandals made in silence, it said, last longer. Especially if you let the morning wind bless the knot. No one's sure where that belief comes from, but it's been whispered in valleys since long before writing arrived. Now here's a sweet detail. Ceremonial sandals often had hidden compartments. Seriously, just tiny pouches stitched beneath the heel to hold charms, bits of coral, bone, or even a pinch of ancestral ash. Not every sandal had one, and you weren't supposed to look. But if you ever stepped in one and felt a curious bump, yeah, that was legacy, cushioning your stride. Here's a curious case for you. In 1923, an anthropologist wrote about finding a sandal with what appeared to be a small shark tooth sewn into the instep. Some dismissed it as debris. Others claimed it was intentional, perhaps meant to warn enemies that the wearer walked with bite. It could also just be one very sharp pebble. Historians still argue whether such additions were symbolic or purely practical. Want something a little dreamier? Picture this. At the start of Makahiki season, the Hawaiian New Year marked by peace and games, young apprentices would present hand-woven sandals to their elders. These weren't fancy, just simple, careful loops. But each pair had to be tied, with one's eyes closed, using only feel. The result? A kind of walking prayer worn during rituals that followed. You didn't wear these to show status. You wore them to remember humility, and we haven't even gotten to the canoe launch sandals. Oh, you'd love these. These were ultralight pairs, crafted specifically to walk across wet sand during ceremonial voyages. Instead of hard soles, they had broad leaf paddings, usually from mountain banana trees, woven to leave minimal traces on the beach. That way, it looked like the canoe party had just appeared by the water's edge. Footsteps vanished by wind and tide. Ghost sandals, basically. There's even a charming old proverb. He mau wawai moe kai. Feet that sleep with the sea. It referred to those who traveled long distances across water, but it was also said of those who wove their own sea sandals. Gentle, poetic, and a little mysterious, like much of what we've seen tonight. Now lean in. There's a story, half legend, half logbook, about a high-ranking priestess who commissioned a pair of copper sandals dyed with octopus ink. That's rare, by the way. The ink was hard to collect and faded quickly, but the effect? Iridescent black straps that shimmered under moonlight. The sandals were said to help her move unseen between temples, as if night itself had wrapped her feet. Of course, octopus dye didn't last long, and the sandals dissolved in rain, which meant she had to walk quickly. Spiritual stealth had its drawbacks. Want one last oddball tidbit? Some ancient sandal designs appear to include what look like toe loops, separate wrappings for the big toe and second toe. That design pops up in other parts of Polynesia too. Some scholars think it helped with grip on slick paths. Others suggest it mimicked birds' feet, invoking the flight of messengers or ancestors. And yes, some simply shrug and say, it was probably comfy. But whatever the reason, the takeaway is the same. Nothing in this culture was accidental. Not a stitch, not a twist, not a toe loop. You step back from the weaver's hut. The air smells like cooled ash and fresh bark. You're holding a sandal now, unfinished. The strap is still loose, the heel loop not yet woven. But you don't mind. There's something soothing about it, something grounding. Maybe you'll finish it tomorrow. And just like that, you're standing at the edge of it all. The final step, literally, on this journey into ancient Hawaiian royal footwear. But don't worry, it's not some grand ceremony or overly symbolic exit. It's quiet, humble, like a sandal left drying on a rock near the shore, half forgotten, but somehow full of stories. Tonight, you learn what happens when royal sandals meet foreign contact, colonial confusion, and the slow unraveling of a sacred thread. It's the 18th century. Now tall ships loom on the horizon. You smell salt, smoke, and iron. Sailors with strange boots and rust-stained buttons step awkwardly onto lava rock beaches. And what do they notice first? Not the lays, not the chants, but the fact that no one wears shoes. Not really. And certainly not the kind with heels or buckles. To Western eyes, this is a sign of primitiveness. But you by now know better. Much better. You see, by the late 1700s, ali'i, royalty, still wore sandals, especially for ceremonial roles. But imported fashion was creeping in. Fabrics from Canton, lace from Spain, hats from England, and shoes, stiff foreign shoes, slowly tiptoed their way into the islands. Not because they were better, but because power follows boots, and influence follows polish. Soon, court paintings start to appear. Figures in stiff collars, glossy leather shoes. But look closer at their feet. In some portraits, the ali'i wear nothing at all, bare soles, even while dressed in heavy velvet coats. Why? Historians still argue whether this was a sign of cultural pride, a refusal to fully conform, or just personal comfort on a hot, humid day. There's even a story about Kamehameha III, the unifier of the islands, being gifted a pair of British dress shoes. He accepted them, smiled politely, and then promptly used them as decorative containers for kukui nuts. Not the most practical storage method, but undeniably symbolic. To him, shoes didn't define power. Feet did. Sandals were tools, not thrones. But the tide kept shifting. By the mid-1800s, Western missionaries pushed hard for proper dress. That meant buttoned shirts, waistcoats, and shoes. Especially shoes. Going barefoot was framed as indecent. And so, slowly, the traditional art of sandal making began to fade. It didn't vanish overnight, though. In rural areas, elders still wove basic pairs for long hikes or hot stone paths. Some used old family patterns, passed down like bedtime songs. Others improvised, twisting twine around scavenged rubber scraps. The art adapted, like it always had. But in royal contexts, the once vibrant language of footwear grew. Quieter, fast, forward to today, and the modern Hawaiian sandal, the slipper, has become an icon in its own right. Rubber, foam, plastic, ubiquitous and loved. But the roots? They go far deeper than most tourists realize. Tucked inside a museum drawer. In Honolulu, there's a fragile old pair of woven sandals, Olona fiber, brittle with age. The straps are thin, the sole's barely there. But they carry the weight of centuries. And on the inside of one heel, a faint marking. Could be a name, could be a prayer. No one knows for sure. Scholars debate whether these were ceremonial or just worn by someone important. Some claim they belonged to a high-ranking kahuna. Others suggest that they were made for a young ali'i wahine, maybe as a coming-of-age gift. But the truth is, probably lost, softened like footprints in the tide. So, what remains? Stories, legends, proverbial footprints, and sandals, always sandals, that speak not of status, but of journey. Sandals that understood the land, that listened as much as they protected. Sandals that left gentle imprints and quietly disappeared. Tonight, you've walked far, across lava plains, through mountain mists, under moonlight and memory. You've followed the thread of kappa, bark, and braided legacy. You've stood in the souls of royalty, sometimes quite literally. And maybe, just maybe, you'll never look at flip-flops the same way again. Because even the humblest of footwear can carry entire histories. You just have to slow down long enough to feel the weave beneath your heel, and hey, remember the unfinished sandal from earlier? You've still got it. Still holding it in your hand. The strap's no longer loose. The weave is tighter now. You smile, not because it's perfect, but because it's yours. Threaded with everything you've heard, felt, and maybe even dreamed tonight. Time to set it down. Somewhere soft, somewhere quiet. Let's take one last breath. So now, as we step away from the footprints and fibers of the past, let everything settle. The night is deeper now, the air still, like a hush after a chant ends. You can almost hear the distant waves, slow, steady, like someone breathing in their sleep. There's no rush to wake, no call to action. Just a gentle reminder that history isn't always loud. Sometimes it tiptoes. Sometimes it lies curled up in the corner of a sandal, waiting to be remembered. Your feet, even if tucked under blankets, feel lighter, like they've wandered someplace ancient and barefoot and deeply human, like they know something now they didn't before. Not a fact, but a feeling. Let your breath lengthen. Let your thoughts blur a little at the edges. And if your dreams take you to misty islands or trails woven with ti leaves, go with them. Walk slowly. Let the past guide your steps like soft-spoken ancestors. There's no wrong turn, no missed moment, just rhythm, just wind, just a story, still unfolding. Thanks for coming along. End of script. Sweet dreams.